The hum of Atlanta's skyline buzzed faintly through the double-paned windows of my 17th-floor office, a sterile cocoon of steel and glass that I'd carved out for myself over the past decade. The desk in front of me was a battlefield, legal briefs stacked like sandbags, a laptop glowing with emails I'd never answer, and a half-empty coffee mug staining the edge of a deposition transcript. My phone vibrated again, skittering an inch across the chaos. Maggie's name flashed on the screen, insistent, like a gnat I couldn't swat away. I let it buzz, my jaw tightening as I flipped through a contract I was supposed to sign by noon. The words blurred. Non-compete clauses, liability waivers. None of it mattered when that damn phone kept trembling, a little tyrant demanding my attention. I'd built this place from nothing. A corner office in Midtown, a view of the gold-domed Capitol glinting in the February sun, a nameplate that read Lauren J. Carver, ESQ in crisp serif font. It was mine, earned through nights of black coffee and days of outmaneuvering men who thought I'd fold because I didn't wear a tie. But Maggie didn't care about that. She never had. To her, I wasn't a lawyer or a woman who'd clawed her way out of a two-bedroom ranch in Macon. I was a vault with a pulse, and she had the combination. The phone stopped, leaving a hollow silence. I exhaled, rubbing my temples, feeling the familiar ache of guilt creeping in. She'd called 3 times already this morning, each one unanswered, each one a brick added to the wall I was trying to build between us. My sister, Maggie, 2 years older and a lifetime angrier, had a way of turning every conversation into a transaction. I could picture her now, pacing her linoleum kitchen 90 miles south, her voice sharp as she rehearsed her next guilt trip. "You owe us, Lauren, after everything Mom and Dad did for you." As if I hadn't spent years paying that debt in cash and silence. It started again. The vibration rattled a pen off the edge of a manila folder, and something in me snapped. I grabbed the phone, thumb hovering over decline, but the weight of it, the years, the expectations, held me there. I answered instead, my voice low and clipped. "What, Maggie?" Finally, she said, her tone a mix of relief and accusation. "I've been calling all morning. Did you forget how to pick up a phone?" "I'm working." I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under me. Beyond the glass, a hawk circled above Peachtree Street, free in a way I hadn't felt since I was a kid. "What do you want?" A pause. Then the sound of her lighting a cigarette, cheap menthols, the kind she'd smoked since high school. "It's the mortgage," she said, exhaling into the receiver. "Payment's due tomorrow, and Jess says the bank's been calling. We're short again." I closed my eyes, the headache blooming into something fiercer. Jess, her husband, hadn't held a steady job since the mill closed in '09, and Maggie's cashier gig at the Piggly Wiggly barely covered their smokes and cable. "How much?" 800, maybe 9. She didn't even hesitate, like she'd rehearsed it. "You know how tight things are, Lauren. You're the only one who stop." I cut her off, my grip tightening on the phone. The office felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and my own rising frustration. "I sent you 2 grand last month. What happened to that?" Another drag, longer this time. "Groceries. Car payment. You think money grows on trees down here." I stood, pacing to the window. The city sprawled below, a chessboard of power I'd learned to play. Deals struck in boardrooms, hands shaken over whiskey at the Capitol Grill. Up here, I was someone. Down there, with her, I was still the little sister who'd made it out, the one who owed them for not drowning in the same quicksand. "I can't keep doing this," I said, more to myself than to her. "You can't keep doing what?" Her voice sharpened, a blade wrapped in velvet. "Helping your family? You're up there in your fancy office, and we're scraping by. You think you're better than us now." The words hit like a slap, and I felt the old anger flare. Hot, jagged, the kind that used to send me storming out of our childhood home with a slammed door. I grabbed a pen from the desk, clicking it furiously until the plastic cracked in my hand. "I'm not your bank, Maggie. Figure it out." Silence stretched, taut as a wire. Then a laugh, bitter and cold. "Figure it out. Right. Easy for you to say, Miss Big Shot. Call me when you remember where you came from." The line went dead. I dropped the phone onto the desk, the broken pen still in my fist, ink bleeding onto my fingers like a wound. My reflection stared back from the window. Sharp suit, tired eyes, a woman caught between the life I'd built and the one I'd escaped. I wanted to scream, to hurl something through the glass and watch it shatter. Instead, I sank back into my chair, the guilt and fury tangling inside me like a knot I couldn't untie. The phone stayed silent, but I knew it wouldn't last. Maggie would call again, or Jess would, or they'd find some new way to pull me back into their orbit. And I'd have to decide, keep cutting checks or cut them off for good. Either way, I could feel the costs piling up, heavier than any mortgage. The ink from the broken pen had dried into a jagged smear across my palm by the time I heard the elevator ping down the hall. It was late, too late for clients or paralegals, and the office had settled into that eerie quiet that only comes after hours when the hum of the city feels like a distant pulse. I sat there, still in my chair, staring at the phone as if it might spring back to life with Maggie's voice. The silence was a reprieve, but it didn't last. My assistant, Carla, poked her head through the door, her brow furrowed in that way that meant trouble. "Lauren, you've got a visitor," she said, her voice clipped, professional, but with an edge I didn't like. He wouldn't take no for an answer. Before I could ask who, Jess shoved past her, filling the doorway with his broad shoulders and the faint stink of sweat and desperation. My brother-in-law hadn't bothered to clean up, worn flannel shirt, unshaven jaw, boots tracking mud onto my Berber carpet. He looked like he'd driven straight from Macon, and knowing him, he probably had. Carla hovered behind him, her hand twitching toward the phone on her desk, like she was ready to call security. I waved her off with a tight nod, my stomach already sinking. "Jess," I said, keeping my voice flat as I stood, "what the hell are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away, just stepped inside, his eyes darting around the room. The leather chairs, the framed diplomas, the view of Atlanta's glittering spine beyond the glass. It was a predator's scan, sizing up the territory, and I felt the air shift, thicken with something I couldn't name yet. I crossed my arms, the ink-stained hand hidden against my sleeve, and waited. "Maggie said you hung up on her," he finally grunted, his voice low, gravelly, the kind that used to scare me when I was a kid crashing on their couch. "Said you're too good to help us now." I laughed, a short, bitter bark that echoed off the walls. "She tell you I'm supposed to bankroll your mortgage again? Because I'm pretty sure I've heard that one before." His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching under the stubble. He took a step closer, close enough that I could see the red in his eyes, the kind that comes from too little sleep and too much cheap beer. "We're family, Lauren. You don't get to just walk away." The words landed like a punch, and for a second, I was back in that cramped Macon kitchen. Mom's cigarette smoke curling around us, Maggie yelling about how I'd ruined everything by leaving, just brooding in the corner with a bottle. I'd fought so hard to escape that, to build this office, this life, and here he was dragging it all back in like mud on his boots. My chest tightened, a mix of guilt and fury I couldn't untangle. "I've been carrying you for years," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "Every time you call, it's the same damn thing." "I'm done, Jess. Done." He flinched, just barely, but it was enough to make me pause. Then he leaned in, his breath hot and sour. "You think you're better than us? Sitting up here in your tower, playing queen. Maggie's crying her eyes out because you won't lift a finger, and I'm supposed to just take it?" The room felt smaller, the walls closing in until it was just me and him, the air crackling with years of unspoken resentment. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat, the broken pen still lying on the desk behind me like a silent witness. I wanted to shove him out, to scream that I didn't owe them my soul, but the words stuck, tangled in the guilt that never quite went away. "Get out," I said instead, low and steady, pointing at the door. "Now." He didn't move, just stood there breathing hard, his hands curling into fists at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might swing, thought I'd have to dodge, or fight, or call Carla back in here with the cops on speed dial. But then he laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped against my nerves. "You'll regret this," he said, turning toward the door. "We're not done with you." He stormed out, the door banging shut behind him, leaving me alone with the echo of his threat. I sank back into my chair, my hands shaking as I pressed them against the desk. The ink stain glared up at me, a dark bruise against the wood, and I felt the first crack in the wall I'd built around myself. Maggie's calls, Jess's ambush, they weren't just asking for money anymore. They were clawing at everything I'd made, pulling me back into a fight I thought I'd won years ago. I grabbed a tissue, scrubbing at the ink on my hand until my skin burned, but it wouldn't come clean. My reflection flickered in the window again. Sharp suit, hollow eyes, a woman caught in the crosshairs of a war I didn't start. I could still hear Jess's boots stomping down the hall, the elevator's ding as it swallowed him up. He'd be back, or Maggie would, or they'd find some new way to twist the knife. And I'd have to decide, keep running or turn and face them head on. The phone buzzed again. Maggie's name flashed, relentless, a summons I couldn't ignore forever. I stared at it, my breath shallow, the weight of it all pressing down until I thought I'd break. Then I reached for it, my fingers trembling, knowing this was only the beginning. The phone buzzed again, Maggie's name pulsing on the screen like a heartbeat I couldn't escape. My office felt like a cage now, the glass walls reflecting the dim glow of my desk lamp, the city beyond reduced to a smear of lights against the February night. I stood there, frozen, my fingers still trembling from Jess's ambush, the ink-stained tissue crumpled in my fist. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of leather and my own sweat, and I could still hear his boots echoing in my head. Stomp, 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 like a drumbeat to a war I didn't want to fight. But Maggie's call was a siren, pulling me back in, and I knew I couldn't dodge it this time. I answered, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. What now? Just got home, she said, her tone sharp, accusatory, the faint hiss of her cigarette crackling through the line. Said you threw him out like he was trash. What the hell, Lauren? I paced to the window, the cold glass pressing against my forehead as I stared down at the ant trail of cars on Peachtree Street. Up here, I could pretend I was untouchable, a queen in a tower Jess had sneered at. Down there, in the real world, my sister was pacing her peeling porch house, chain-smoking her way through another crisis I was supposed to fix. He barged in here, Maggie, I said, my breath fogging the glass. Track mud all over my carpet, threatened me, threatened you. She cut me off, her laugh a jagged edge. He's trying to keep a roof over our heads, and you're whining about your damn carpet? I snapped. The pen I'd grabbed from the desk, one of those cheap Bics I kept in a drawer, cracked in my hand, the plastic splintering as I gripped it too hard. Ink bled onto my fingers again, a fresh wound over the old stain, and I flung it across the room. It hit the wall with a pathetic thwack, leaving a black smear beside a framed photo of me at my law school graduation. I'm not your ATM, I said, my voice rising, raw and unsteady. You've been bleeding me dry for years, and I'm done. Silence stretched, taut and brittle. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, the way it got when she was gearing up for a fight. You're done, she finally said, low and dangerous. After everything we've been through. You're just gonna cut us off? Mom and Dad would be ashamed of you. That hit like a fist to the gut. I leaned against the desk, my knees weak, the guilt surging up like bile. Mom's tired eyes flashed in my mind, her working doubles at the diner so I could have books, Dad's callous hands fixing my bike so I could ride to school. They'd given me everything, and I'd paid it back by leaving, by building this life while Maggie stayed stuck. But the anger was there too, hot and sharp, clawing at the guilt until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Don't you dare bring them into this, I said, my voice trembling but firm. They didn't raise me to be your punching bag or your bank account. Then what did they raise you for? She shot back. To sit up there in your fancy office, pretending you're not one of us? Jess is right. You think you're better than us now. The words echoed Jess's, a coordinated assault, and I felt the room tilt. My office, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a lie, a shiny shell hiding the scared kid from Macon who'd never really escaped. I wanted to scream, to tell her I'd earned every inch of this place, but the words stuck in my throat, tangled with the despair creeping in. I can't do this anymore, I said instead, quieter now, the fight draining out of me. I just can't. She didn't answer right away. I heard the flick of her lighter, the long drag she took, and I could picture her standing by her kitchen sink, staring out at the dead grass of their backyard. Fine, she said at last, her voice cold as steel. You want to play hardball? We'll see how far that gets you. The line went dead, leaving me with the hum of the dial tone and a sinking certainty that this wasn't over. I dropped the phone onto the desk, my hands shaking as I sank into my chair. The broken pen lay on the floor, a dark streak against the carpet, and I stared at it, my chest tight with frustration and something darker. Despair, maybe, or the first flicker of resolve. I tried to draw a line, but Maggie and Jess weren't the type to respect boundaries. They'd keep coming, keep pushing, until I either gave in or broke something bigger than a pen. The next morning, I met Kate at a midtown cafe, a little place off 10th Street, all exposed brick and overpriced lattes. The air smelled of burnt espresso and cinnamon, and the chatter of the brunch crowd buzzed around us like white noise. I sat across from her at a wobbly table, my hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't touched, the steam curling up between us. Kate, my law school roommate turned confidant, leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes scanning me over the rim of her cup. She'd always had a way of seeing through my bullshit, and today was no exception. You look like hell, she said, blunt as ever, setting her latte down with a clink. What happened? I laughed, a hollow sound that didn't reach my eyes. Maggie and Jess happened. Again. I told her everything. The calls, Jess storming my office, the fight that left me with ink-stained hands and a fractured sense of self. My voice cracked as I got to the part about Maggie's threat, and I stared down at the table, tracing a scratch in the wood with my nail. Kate didn't say anything at first, just sipped her coffee, letting the silence settle. Outside, a streetcar rumbled by, its bell clanging faintly through the window. They're not going to stop, you know, she said finally, her tone matter of fact. They've got nothing to lose, and you've got everything. I nodded, my throat tight. The cafe felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in, the chatter too loud. I could still hear Maggie's voice in my head. Asterisk, we'll see how far that gets you, asterisk, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I told her I'm done, I said, almost a whisper. But it doesn't feel like it worked. Because it didn't, Kate said, leaning forward now, her elbows on the table. You snapped a pen, not a lifeline. They'll keep coming until you make it hurt. Her words landed like a stone in my gut. I wanted to argue, to say I couldn't hurt them. They were family, they were broken, they were mine to fix. But the truth was, I didn't know how much more I could take. The frustration was a live wire inside me, sparking against the guilt, the anger, the bone-deep exhaustion of being their savior. I took a sip of my latte, the heat scalding my tongue, and winced. What do I do then? I asked, meeting her gaze. Cut them off for real? Change my number, move, pretend they don't exist? Kate shrugged, a rare softness in her eyes. You could, or you could fight back. But whatever you do, you've got to pick a side, yours or theirs. No more straddling the line. I looked out the window at the people bustling past, suits on their way to meetings, students with backpacks, a city moving forward while I felt stuck. The cafe's warmth was suffocating now, the smell of coffee turning my stomach. I'd spent years building a life up here, away from Macon's quicksand, but Maggie and Jess were pulling me back in, inch by inch. And Kate was right, they wouldn't stop. Not until I made them. The thought twisted inside me, a knot of resolve tightening against the despair. I didn't know what fighting back looked like yet. Cutting checks was easier than cutting ties, but sitting there with the taste of burnt coffee on my tongue and Maggie's threat ringing in my ears, I knew I couldn't keep bending. Not anymore. The Midtown Cafe was a hive of clinking mugs and murmured conversations when I stepped inside that Tuesday afternoon, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and buttery pastries. I'd come straight from the office, my briefcase slung over one shoulder, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor as I scanned the room for an empty table. The place was a patchwork of faces, tech brothers in hoodies, women in yoga gear sipping matcha, a guy in a corner scribbling in a notebook like he was penning the next great American novel. I found a spot near the window, the glass streaked with late February drizzle, and dropped into a chair, the weight of the past few days settling into my bones. I'd barely opened my laptop when the door banged open, loud enough to cut through the hum of the crowd. Heads turned, and I felt a prickle of unease before I even saw him, Jess, storming in like a bull let loose, his flannel shirt damp from the rain, his boots leaving wet smears on the floor. My stomach dropped, a cold knot of dread twisting tight. He spotted me instantly, his eyes locking onto mine across the room, and I knew this wasn't a coincidence. He'd tracked me down, hunted me like I was prey, and the cafe's cozy buzz turned suffocating in an instant. Lauren, his voice boomed, raw and jagged, slicing through the chatter. Conversations faltered, forks paused midair, and I felt every pair of eyes swivel toward us. He strode over, his fists clenched, his face flushed with a fury I hadn't seen since the night he'd punched a hole in their trailer wall. You think you can just cut us off? Block our numbers like we're nothing? I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the table, the wood cool and slick under my palms. The cafe shrank around me, the walls pressing in until it was just me and him, the air crackling with his rage and my rising panic. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stand, my chair scraping loud against the floor. Jess not here, I said, my voice low, pleading, though I knew it wouldn't stop him. It never did. Not here. He laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that made the woman at the next table flinch. You don't get to decide that, Miss High and Mighty. You think you're too good for us now, huh? Sitting here with your fancy coffee while Maggie's crying her eyes out. The accusation stung, sharp and familiar, and I felt the old guilt clawing at me, warring with the fear pulsing in my chest. People were staring now, openly, unapologetically, their phones creeping out of pockets, ready to capture whatever mess this became. I could feel their judgment, their curiosity, pressing against me like a physical weight. My office, my tower, was miles away. Here, in this exposed little cafe, I was just a woman unraveling in public. I told you I'm done, I said, my voice shaking but gaining strength, each word a brick in a wall I was desperate to rebuild. I'm not your bankroll anymore. You and Maggie need to figure it out. His eyes narrowed, a predator sizing up a fight, and he stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the rain on him, the sour tang of sweat and desperation. Figure it out, he spat, his voice dropping to a growl. You're abandoning us, Lauren. Family doesn't do that. You owe us. I don't owe you a damn thing. The words burst out, louder than I meant, and the cafe went silent, a collective intake of breath. My hands trembled, but I clenched them into fists, the ink stains from yesterday still faint on my skin, a reminder of every line I'd tried to draw. I've paid enough, years of checks, years of guilt. I'm done. For a moment, he just stared, his chest heaving, his mouth twisting into something ugly. Then he lunged forward, slamming his hands on the table, my laptop jolting an inch toward the edge. You selfish bitch, he hissed, low enough that only I could hear, but the venom in it hit like a slap. Maggie's right. You've turned your back on us. We'll make you pay for this. The threat hung there, heavy and real, and I felt a shiver of fear ripple through me, cold and sharp. But beneath it, something else sparked. Anger, yes, but also a flicker of something harder, something like steel. I straightened, meeting his gaze, my heart pounding but my voice steady. Get out, Jess, before you make this worse. He didn't move at first, just glared, his breath hot and ragged. The barista behind the counter shifted, her hand hovering near the phone, and I saw a guy in a suit start to stand like he might intervene. Then Jess laughed again, a bitter, broken sound, and stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. Fine, he said, loud enough for the room to hear. Run away, Lauren. Hide up in your tower. But this ain't over. He turned and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him, the bell above it jangling wildly. The cafe exhaled, conversation stuttering back to life, but the stares lingered, hot on my skin. I sank into my chair, my legs weak, my pulse hammering in my throat. My laptop screen glowed blankly, my coffee sat cold, and I could still feel him, his rage, his threat, lingering in the air like smoke. I pulled out my phone, my fingers shaking as I opened the contacts. Maggie's name glowed at me, Jess is right below it, twin anchors dragging me down. I told Kate I didn't know what fighting back looked like, but sitting there with the echo of Jess's words in my ears and the weight of every eye in the room, I felt the decision crystallize. I tapped Maggie's name, then block, the little confirmation pop up a quiet victory. Jess's followed, another chain snapped. My chest tightened, fear. Yes, but also a rush of something fierce, something like freedom. The drizzle outside had thickened into a steady rain, streaking the window beside me, blurring the world beyond. I stared at it, my reflection faint in the glass. A woman in a sharp blazer, eyes wide but hardening. A stranger I was just starting to recognize. Blocking their numbers wouldn't stop them, Jess's outburst proved that. They'd come for me again, in person, through guilt, through whatever weapons they could wield. But I wasn't bending anymore. Not today. Hours later, back in my office, the city lights glittered through the rain-slicked windows, a kaleidoscope of power and possibility. I sat at my desk, the silence a stark contrast to the cafe's chaos, and tried to focus on a brief I'd promised a client by morning. But my mind kept circling back. Jess's hands on the table, the onlooker's stares, the moment I'd cut those digital ties. My phone stayed quiet now, a rare peace, but it felt like the calm before a storm. Then Carla burst in, her face pale, her usual calm shattered. "Lauren, you need to see this," she said, thrusting her tablet at me. The screen glowed with an X post, time-stamped an hour ago, from Maggie's account. Asterisk, my sister Lauren Carver stole our inheritance. Millions mom and dad left us. She's living it up in Atlanta while we're losing our home. Blood don't mean nothing to her. Asterisk below it, a blurry photo of me in my office, snapped through the window months ago, my silhouette stark against the glass. My breath caught, a cold wave of fury washing over me. The lie was bold, vicious, a Molotov cocktail lobbed into my life. Inheritance? There'd been nothing but debt when mom and dad died, debt I'd paid off, alongside their mortgage, their medical bills. Maggie knew that. This wasn't just a plea for pity, it was a declaration of war. I scrolled the replies, strangers calling me a thief, a heartless elitist, a few even tagging my firm's account. My hand shook, not with fear now, but with a rage so pure it burned. The cafe had been a skirmish, this was the real battle. Maggie wasn't just clawing at me anymore. She was trying to tear down everything I'd built, brick by brick. I set the tablet down, my jaw tight, my mind racing. Blocking them wasn't enough. They'd turned this into a public execution, and I couldn't just sit here, bleeding out in silence. I looked up at Carla, her eyes wide with worry, and felt that steel inside me sharpen into something dangerous, something resolute. "Call Kate," I said, my voice steady despite the storm churning inside. "And give me every financial record I've got, every check I wrote them, every wire transfer, every goddamn dime. They want to fight? They're getting one." Carla nodded and hurried out, leaving me alone with the hum of the city and the weight of my own awakening. The rain battered the windows, relentless, but I barely heard it. My reflection stared back from the glass. Sharp suit, fierce eyes, a woman done running. Maggie's lie was the spark. My fury was the fire. And I'd make damn sure it burned hotter than hers. The rain had thickened into a relentless curtain by the time I left my office that night. The kind of downpour that turned Atlanta's streets into rivers and smeared the city lights into a hazy glow. My heels clicked against the wet pavement as I hurried toward the parking garage, my coat pulled tight against the wind, my mind still churning with Maggie's ex-post and the venom dripping from every word. The tablet Carla had handed me felt like a live grenade in my briefcase. Its screen burned into my memory. Asterisk, stole our inheritance. Asterisk, millions. Lies so bold they'd have been laughable if they weren't shredding my name in real time. I told Carla to dig up the financial records, but I knew what they'd show. Years of checks, wire transfers, a lifeline I'd thrown them over and over, now twisted into a noose around my neck. I reached my car, a sleek black Audi I bought after my first big case, and slid inside, the leather cold against my legs. The dashboard clock glowed 8:47 p.m., too late to call Kate, too early to sleep off the rage simmering in my chest. I started the engine, the hum of faint comfort, and pulled out onto Peachtree Street, the wipers slashing at the rain like they could cut through the mess my family had made. My phone sat silent in the passenger seat, Maggie and Jess's numbers blocked, but the quiet felt hollow, a fragile shield against the storm I knew was coming. I didn't head home. Instead, I turned south, toward a part of the city I rarely visited anymore. A squat brick building off Ponce de Leon, its neon sign flickering O'Malley's pub in faded red. It wasn't my usual scene. No polished bar tops or $20 cocktails here. Just a dive where the air smelled of stale beer and the jukebox played Springsteen on a loop. But it was where Hank Sullivan liked to unwind, and right now I needed him more than I needed a martini. Hank was my mentor, a grizzled ex-prosecutor who'd taken me under his wing when I was a green associate with more ambition than sense. He'd retired from the firm 2 years ago, but we still met monthly to talk shop. Mergers, depositions, the kind of high-stakes chess I'd learned to play under his watch. Tonight wasn't about business, though. It was about survival. The pub was half empty when I pushed through the door, the bell above it jingling faintly. A couple of guys in trucker hats hunched over the bar. A woman in a leather jacket fed quarters into the jukebox, and Hank sat in a corner booth, nursing a bourbon and scribbling notes on a napkin. His silver hair caught the dim light, and his suit, rumpled but sharp, marked him as out of place among the flannel and denim. He looked up as I approached, his gray eyes narrowing at the sight of me dripping wet and wired tight. "Jesus, Lauren," he said, shoving the napkin aside as I slid into the booth. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" I dropped my briefcase beside me, the leather creaking as I leaned forward, my hands clasped tight to keep them from shaking. The air here was warm, thick with the scent of fried onions and whiskey, but it did nothing to ease the chill in my bones. "It's Maggie and Jess," I said, my voice low, rougher than I meant it to be. "They're coming for me, Hank." "Hard." He raised an eyebrow, sipping his bourbon without breaking eye contact. "Define hard." I pulled out my phone, not to call, but to show him. The screen flared to life, and I opened X, Maggie's post staring back at us like a taunt. Hank took the device, his lips thinning as he scrolled, the faint clink of ice in his glass the only sound between us. I watched his face, creased with years of courtroom battles, unflappable even now, and waited for the verdict I knew he'd deliver. "She's lying through her teeth," he said finally, setting the phone down with a deliberate thud. "Inheritance? Your folks didn't leave a dime. Hell, you paid off their debts. What's her angle?" I exhaled, a shaky breath that fogged the air between us. "Money, control, spite, take your pick." Jess stormed into a cafe today, screamed at me in front of half of Midtown. Now this. They're not just asking anymore. They're trying to ruin me. Hank leaned back, crossing his arms, his gaze steady but sharper now, like he was sizing up an opponent across a witness stand. The jukebox kicked into Born to Run, the opening chords cutting through the murmur of the bar, and I felt a pang. Springsteen had been Dad's favorite, a memory that twisted the knife Maggie had plunged deeper today. "Sounds like they're desperate," Hank said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Desperate people get sloppy. What's your play?" I stared at the table, the wood scarred with initials and beer rings, a map of nights I'd never lived. My reflection flickered in the bourbon bottle between us. Sharp blazer, wild eyes, a woman teetering on an edge I hadn't seen coming. I told Carla to pull every record, every payment I've made them. I want to hit back, expose the truth. But I trailed off, the words catching in my throat. "But what?" Hank pressed, leaning forward now, his elbows on the table. "You're not sure you can pull the trigger?" I flinched, the question too close to the bone. The bar's dim light cast shadows across his face, and for a moment I saw Dad there, his quiet strength, his belief in me, the way he'd tell me to stand tall even when Maggie's shadow loomed larger. "They're family," I said, almost a whisper. "I've spent years telling myself I owe them, Mom and Dad's memory, the life I got out of Macon. Cutting them off feels like betraying that." Hank snorted, a dry sound that cut through my doubt. "Family doesn't mean a free pass to bleed you dry. You've been their lifeline, Lauren, not their punching bag. They're betting on your guilt to keep you in line. Question is, how long you gonna let him?" His words landed like a gavel, heavy and final, and I felt something shift inside me. a crack in the wall of guilt I'd built, letting a sliver of clarity through. I thought of Jess in the cafe, his fists on the table, the crowd stares. Maggie's post, a public execution of lies. They weren't fighting for survival, they were fighting to keep me tethered, a cash cow they could milk until I broke. And I'd let them because the alternative felt too cold, too final. I blocked their numbers today, I said, meeting his gaze, my voice steadier now. After Jess's stunt. It felt good, scary but good. But this, I gestured at the phone, Maggie's words glowing like a brand. This is bigger. They're not stopping. Hank nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, the kind he used to flash when I'd nail a cross-examination. Damn right they're not. But neither are you. You've got the proof, use it. Drag their bullshit into the light. They want a war. Give 'em when they can't win. I sat back, the booth's cracked vinyl creaking under me, and let his words settle. The bar hummed around us, laughter from the truckers, the clatter of a glass hitting the counter, and I felt a strange calm creeping in, edged with something fierce. Hank was right. I'd been playing defense, dodging their jabs, but I wasn't the scared kid from making any more. I'd built a life, a tower. Jess had called it, and I'd be damned if I let them tear it down. What about the firm? I asked, my mind racing ahead. This hits X. Clients might see it. I can't let it tank everything I've worked for. Hank tapped the napkin he'd been scribbling on, sliding it toward me. It was a rough sketch, names, dates, a timeline of a merger we'd been reviewing last month. You're not the only one with enemies, kid. Every big player's got dirt flung at M eventually. You've got the records, the truth, spin it. Get ahead of it. Hell, call a press conference if you have to. Show him who's in control. A press conference. The idea hit like a spark, igniting something reckless and bold inside me. I could see it, me at a podium, the city skyline behind me, laying out the numbers, the years of payments, the lies Maggie had spun. Not just defense, but offense, a move to take back the board, not just hold my ground. I grabbed the bourbon bottle, pouring a splash into the spare glass Hank had ordered for me, the amber liquid glinting in the dim light. Okay, I said, raising it to him, my voice firm now, the tremor gone. War it is. He clinked his glass against mine, a grin breaking through the grizzle. That's my girl. Now let's talk strategy, because they're not going to see this coming. The bourbon burn going down, sharp and warm, matching the fire building in my chest. Outside, the rain battered the windows, a relentless drumbeat. But inside, I felt the shift, fear giving way to fury, guilt hardening into resolve. Maggie and Jess had pushed too far, and I was done bending. They wanted to drag me back to Macon's quicksand. I'd bury them in Atlanta's concrete first. The bourbon's heat still lingered in my throat as I left O'Malley's, the rain slapping against my coat like a warning I couldn't heed. Hank's words echoed in my skull. Asterisk, give 'em when they can't win asterisk. A drumbeat syncing with the wipers as I drove back through Atlanta's slick streets. The city loomed around me, its towers of glass and steel glowing through the downpour, a fortress I'd claimed as mine. But Maggie's lie on X had cracked that armor, and I could feel the pressure building, a vice tightening around my ribs. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, the ink stains from yesterday a faint shadow on my skin. I wasn't just fighting for money or pride anymore. This was about survival, about who I'd let myself become. Back in my office, the clock on my desk blinked 10:13 p.m. The silence thick, except for the faint hum of the HVAC. The rain battered the windows, a relentless siege, and I stood there, staring at the city below, my city now a battlefield. Carla had left a stack of papers on my chair, neatly clipped, bank statements, canceled checks, wire transfer receipts. Every dime I'd sent Maggie and Jess over the past decade, laid out in black and white, a paper trail of my guilt, my loyalty, my slow bleed. I flipped through it, the numbers blurring into a tally of years I'd never get back. $2,000 here, $800 there, a $5,000 lump sum when their roof caved in after a storm. Hundreds of thousands, maybe more, funneled south to Macon while I built this life up here. My phone buzzed, a text from Kate. Asterisk, records pulled. X is blowing up. hundreds of replies. You okay? Asterisk, I didn't answer. Instead, I opened the app, the screen flaring bright in the dim room. Maggie's post had metastasized, retweets in the thousands, comments piling up like debris after a wreck. Typical rich lawyer scum, one read. Hope she loses everything, another. A few tagged my firm, my clients, my life. My chest tightened, a mix of fury and something colder, fear, maybe, or the dawning weight of what this could cost me. I scrolled until I hit a reply from Jess. Asterisk, she'll pay for turning her back on us. Watch. Asterisk, no bluff, no bluster, just a promise, stark and sure. The room tilted, the walls pressing in until the air felt too thin to breathe. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking as I sank into my chair, the leather creaking under me. The view beyond the glass mocked me now. Peachtree Street's glittering spine, the gold dome of the Capitol winking through the storm. I'd fought for this, clawed my way up from nothing, and they were tearing it down with a single lie. Embezzlement? There'd been no millions, no inheritance, just mom and dad's debts, their funeral costs, the house I'd sold to keep them afloat. Maggie knew that. She'd been there when I wrote the checks, when I cried over their graves. This wasn't desperation, it was revenge, pure and venomous, for daring to say no. I grabbed the stack of records, my fingers digging into the paper until it crumpled. The numbers stared back, a lifeline I'd thrown them, now a weapon they'd turned on me. My breath came shallow, ragged, the fury boiling up until I could taste it. Bitter, metallic, alive. I wanted to scream, to hurl the files through the window and watch them scatter in the rain. Instead, I stood, pacing the length of the room, my heels clicking against the hardwood like gunfire. The pressure was unbearable, a weight crushing my chest, but beneath it, something sharper was taking shape. Resolve, hard and unyielding, forged in the heat of their betrayal. The press conference idea Hank had tossed out flickered back, bold and reckless, a match struck in the dark. I could see it, me at a podium, the skyline behind me, those records spread out like evidence in a trial. Not just defense, but a counterstrike, laying bare their lies, my payments, the truth they'd twisted. My firm's conference room was 2 floors up, all glass and steel, a stage fit for a reckoning. I'd face the cameras, the questions, Maggie and Jess if they dared show up. The thought sent a jolt through me. Fear, yes, but also a thrill, a hunger to take back what was mine. I grabbed my phone, dialing Kate despite the hour. She picked up on the second ring, her voice groggy but alert. Lauren, what's happening? Press conference, I said, my words tumbling out, clipped and urgent. Tomorrow noon. Firm's conference room. I'm going public, every record, every lie they've spread. I need you there. A pause, then a low whistle. Holy shit, you're serious. Okay, I'm in. What else? Carla's got the files. Bring your A game, legal, PR, whatever you've got. They want a war, Kate. I'm ending it. She laughed, a sharp, approving sound. That's the Lauren I know. Get some sleep. You're gonna need it. Sleep wasn't an option. I hung up, the phone warm in my hand, and turned back to the window. The rain had eased, leaving streaks on the glass like tears, the city beyond shimmering in the aftermath. My reflection stared back, sharp suit, wild eyes, a woman on the edge of something massive. I could feel the pressure peaking, a tidal wave cresting inside me. But I wasn't drowning, not yet. I'd built this tower, this life, and I'd be damned if I let them burn it down. The next morning came fast, the sky clearing into a brittle blue as I stood in my office, prepping for noon. Carla had turned the conference room into a war room. Projector humming, files stacked, a podium dragged in from storage. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her face tight with worry she didn't voice, and I felt a pang of gratitude for her steady presence. Kate arrived at 11, her blazer crisp, her eyes bright with the kind of focus she'd honed in law school mock trials. X is still raging, she said, dropping her bag on a chair. They're calling you everything but a saint. You ready for this? I nodded, my throat dry. Ready as I'll get. The record sat on the table, a thick dossier of my past, and I ran my fingers over them, the paper cool against my skin. My chest was a tangle, fury at Maggie's lie, fear of the fallout, a stubborn resolve to see it through. The room smelled of fresh coffee and toner, the air buzzing with static as the clock ticked closer to noon. At 11:50, the reporters started trickling in. Local stations, a few bloggers, a stringer from the Journal Constitution. They milled around the conference table, cameras clicking, voices murmuring, their eyes on me like hawks circling prey. I stood by the window, the city sprawling below, its pulse steady while mine raced. My suit was pressed, my hair pulled back, but my hands trembled as I gripped the podium's edge, the wood smooth and cold. This was it, the moment I'd either reclaim my name or lose it for good. The clock hit noon. I stepped forward, the room hushing as I tapped the mic, a sharp thump cutting through the tension. Good afternoon, I started, my voice steady despite the storm inside. I'm Lauren Carver, and I'm here to set the record straight. I laid it out, mom and dad's debts, the debts I'd paid, the house I'd sold off. I held up the records, page after page, my voice rising as I listed the payments. 2000 in March 2016, 800 in July 2019, 5 grand in November 2022 when their roof collapsed. The camera's word, the reporter scribbled, and I felt the weight lifting, replaced by a fire I couldn't douse. My sister, Maggie, claims I stole an inheritance. There was none. These, I slapped the stack down, the sound echoing, are what I gave them. Years of support twisted into a lie. The room buzzed, questions bubbling up, but I wasn't done. Yesterday, I announced the Financial Freedom Foundation, aid for families like mine, stuck in cycles they can't break. That's my legacy, not theft. Maggie and Jess want to drag me down because I said no more. I'm done bleeding for them. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and then I saw them, Maggie and Jess, slipping in at the back, her in a faded jacket, him in that damn flannel. My heart lurched, but I didn't falter. Their eyes locked on mine, hers cold, his burning, and I felt the air shift, the stakes spiking higher. The reporters hadn't noticed them yet, but I knew they would. This wasn't just a press conference anymore. It was a showdown, and I was all in. Questions? I said, my gaze steady on them, daring them to move. The pressure was crushing, a vice around my chest, but beneath it I felt alive, furious, desperate, unbreakable. They'd pushed me to the edge, and I was pushing back. The conference room buzzed with a restless hum as I stood at the podium, the weight of Maggie and Jess's presence at the back, like a blade pressed against my spine. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of coffee and the faint tang of camera equipment, the glass walls reflecting the stark noon light into a kaleidoscope of tension. My hands gripped the podium's edge, the wood slipped beneath my palms, and I could feel the sweat beating at the nape of my neck despite the chill running through me. The reporter's eyes darted between me and the stack of financial records I just slammed down, their pens scratching like insects, but it was Maggie's glare, cold, unyielding, a storm brewing in her silence, that pinned me in place. Jess stood beside her, fists clenched in that damn flannel, his jaw tight with a fury I knew too well. They hadn't come to listen. They'd come to fight. I'd just laid out my truth. Years of payments, the non-existent inheritance, the Financial Freedom Foundation I'd announced yesterday as my counterstrike. My voice still echoed in my ears, sharp and steady despite the tremor I'd fought to suppress. Asterisk, I'm done bleeding for them. Asterisk, the words had felt like a release, a line drawn in blood. But now, with them here, that line wavered, a fragile thread stretched to breaking. The room seemed to shrink, the glass walls curving inward until it was just us, me at the front, them at the back, and a dozen strangers waiting for the next move in a game I hadn't wanted to play. A reporter in the front row, a wiry guy with a notepad and a pinched face, raised his hand, breaking the silence. Ms. Carver, your sister's post claims you embezzled millions. You're saying it's all fabricated? No truth at all. I forced my gaze away from Maggie, locking eyes with him instead, my pulse hammering in my throat. Not a shred, I said, my voice firm, though it felt like shouting into a void. My parents left debt, not millions. I paid it off, their mortgage, their bills, their funerals. Then I kept paying for years to keep my sister and her husband afloat. Those records, I tapped the stack again. The sound sharp in the quiet prove it. Every dime I sent them, every lie they've spun. Maggie shifted, a rustle of fabric that drew my attention like a gunshot. She stepped forward, her faded jacket hanging loose on her frame, her face a mask of resentment carved deep by years of bitterness. The reporters turned, cameras swiveling, a murmur rippling through the crowd as they sensed the shift. Jess stayed put, arms crossed, but his eyes burned into me, daring me to keep going. I wanted to look away, to focus on the podium, the city skyline gleaming beyond the glass, but her presence was a magnet, pulling me back to Macon's quicksand, to the sister who'd once braided my hair and now wielded lies like a blade. Lauren, she said, her voice cutting through the room, low and venomous, the kind of tone she'd used when we were kids, and I'd crossed her. You gonna stand there and play victim? Tell these people you're some saint. The air thickened, a vice closing around my chest. My mouth went dry, but I straightened, my fingers digging into the podium until my knuckles ached. I'm telling them the truth, Maggie. Something you've forgotten how to do. She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that scraped against my nerves, and took another step, closing the distance between us. The reporters parted, a sea of wide eyes and clicking shutters, their hunger for drama palpable. Truth, she spat, her cigarette-stained fingers jabbing the air. You ran off to your big city, left us drowning, and now you want to act like you're the hero? You stole our chance, Mom and Dad's money, our future, and you're up here bragging about it. The lie hit like a slap, bold and shameless, and I felt the fury surge, hot and jagged, drowning the guilt that had tethered me to her for so long. My vision narrowed, the room fading until it was just her and me, the past and present colliding in a roar I couldn't contain. There was no money. I shouted, my voice breaking free, raw and unrestrained. I sold the house to pay their debts. You were there, Maggie. You saw the bank statements, the foreclosure notices. I gave you everything I had, and you're standing here twisting it into this bullshit because I finally said no. Her eyes flared, a flicker of something, shock, maybe, or the first crack in her armor, but it vanished as fast as it came, replaced by a sneer. You said no because you're selfish, Lauren. Always have been. You think this, she waved a hand at the conference room, the glass walls, the skyline, makes you better than us? You're nothing without family, and you threw us away. The words sliced deep, a wound I'd carried since I left Macon, but they didn't buckle me, not this time. I stepped out from behind the podium, closing the gap between us, the hardwood cool under my heels. The reporters scrambled, cameras flashing, but I barely noticed. Maggie's breath was sharp with menthol, her face inches from mine, and I could see the lines etched around her eyes, the toll of a life I'd tried to save her from. My chest heaved, a storm of anger and despair and something fiercer, resolve, sharpened to a point. I didn't throw you away, I said, my voice low now, steady despite the chaos inside. I carried you for years, checks, calls, every guilt trip you threw at me. I built this life, Maggie, and you're trying to burn it down because I won't let you bleed me dry anymore. That's not family. That's a parasite. Her hand twitched, and for a heartbeat, I thought she'd hit me, thought we'd end up sprawled on the floor like we had as kids, fighting over the last scraps of something broken. But Jess moved then, lunging forward, his boots loud against the hardwood. You watch your mouth, he growled, shoving between us, his bulk a wall of flannel and rage. She's your sister, you ungrateful, enough? The voice wasn't mine. It cut through the room like a whip, sharp and commanding, and I turned, startled, to see Chuck stepping in from the side door. My husband, ex-husband, technically, though the divorce had never felt final, stood there in a tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair catching the light, his face a mix of exhaustion and steel. The reporters pivoted, confused, but I barely registered them. Chuck's presence was a jolt, a lifeline I hadn't expected. He strode forward, his steps deliberate, his gaze locked on Jess. Back off, he said, his voice low but unyielding, the kind he'd used in boardrooms before he walked away from corporate law to teach. Jess froze, his fist still clenched, but Chuck didn't flinch. He turned to Maggie, his eyes narrowing. You've got no business here, Maggie. You want to lie about Lauren? Fine. But you don't get to storm in and play victim when she's got the receipts. Maggie's mouth opened, then closed, her defiance faltering under Chuck's stare. I felt a rush of something, relief, maybe, or the first flicker of hope, watching him stand there, a shield I hadn't known I needed. We drifted apart after the divorce, our marriage a casualty of my ambition and his retreat, but here he was, wading into the mess I'd made. Chuck, I started, my voice softer, unsteady, but he waved me off, stepping closer to the podium. She's right, he said, addressing the room now, his tone calm but firm. I was there when her parents died. No inheritance, just bills. Lauren paid them, then kept paying Maggie and Jess. I watched it drain her money, time, peace. She's no thief. She's a lifeline they've choked on. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum swallowing the tension. Maggie's face twisted, a mix of fury and something broken, and Jess shifted, his anger deflated but not gone. The reporters scribbled furiously, cameras rolling, but I couldn't look away from Chuck. His words were a mirror, reflecting the years I'd buried under guilt, and I felt the weight shift, anger giving way to a raw, aching clarity. Maggie found her voice, weaker now, brittle. You're taking her side? After everything. Chuck met her gaze, unflinching. I'm taking the truth side. You should try it sometime. She flinched, and for a moment I saw the sister I'd lost, the one who'd laughed with me over burnt dinners, who'd cried when I left for Atlanta. But that Maggie was gone, buried under resentment and lies, and the woman in front of me was a stranger wielding a torch. Jess grabbed her arm, tugging her back, his mutter lost in the shuffle as they retreated toward the door. The reporters surged, shouting questions. Maggie, any response? Miss Carver, what's next? But I barely heard them. My legs trembled, and I gripped the podium again, anchoring myself as the room spun. Chuck stepped closer, his hand hovering near my elbow, not quite touching. You okay? He asked, his voice low, the old warmth there despite the years apart. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. My throat burned, my chest a tangle of triumph and despair. Thanks, I managed, meeting his eyes, steady, gray, a harbor in the storm. I didn't expect you. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Saw the ex-post. Knew you'd need backup. Gala's tonight. Thought I'd check in first. The gala. I'd almost forgotten the Financial Freedom Foundation's launch, a black tie affair at the Ritz-Carlton, a room full of donors and press I'd have to face after this. My stomach twisted, but Chuck's presence steadied me, a reminder I wasn't alone. Maggie and Jess were gone, slipping out under the clamor, but their retreat wasn't a surrender. This was the peak, the clash I'd braced for, and I'd held my ground, barely. The reporters pressed in, their questions a barrage, but I raised a hand, my voice cutting through. That's all for now. Tonight, at the gala, I'll say more. Thank you. I stepped back, Chuck at my side, and felt the pressure ease, a crack letting light through the chaos. The fight wasn't over. Maggie's lies still lingered, Jess's threat echoed. But I'd faced them head on, and I was still standing. The chandelier light in the Ritz-Carlton's grand ballroom bathed the room in a warm, golden glow, refracting off crystal flutes and polished silverware as Atlanta's elite mingled in their tuxedos and gowns. I stood near the edge of the crowd, my black dress clinging to me like a second skin, the weight of the day still pressing against my ribs. The air buzzed with murmured conversations, the clink of glasses, the faint strains of a string quartet weaving through it all, a scene of power and privilege I'd fought to belong to. My hands were steady now, clutching a glass of champagne I hadn't sipped, but my eyes kept darting to the arched entryway, waiting for Chuck. He'd promised to be here after the press conference, his quiet "see you tonight," lingering in my ears like a lifeline. The gala was the Financial Freedom Foundation's debut, a cause I'd poured my soul into, a way to turn my family's quicksand into something solid for others. Donors circled the room, their smiles tight with curiosity, their whispers tinged with the ex-post fallout. I could feel their stares, some admiring, some skeptical, pricking my skin like needles. The press conference had been a grenade, and this was the aftermath. A room full of players waiting to see if I'd fold or rise. My chest tightened, a familiar vice, but beneath it, something new flickered. Hope, maybe, or the stubborn resolve that had carried me this far. Then I saw him. Chuck slipped through the double doors alone, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the crowd, his suit crisp despite the day's chaos. No plus one, no hesitation, just him, his gray eyes scanning until they found me. My breath caught, a rush of relief washing over me, softening the edges of the tension I'd carried since Maggie and Jess stormed out. He moved toward me, his stride steady, and the room seemed to tilt, the chatter fading until it was just us, two people who'd once shared a life, now standing on opposite sides of a bridge I wasn't sure could hold. "You made it," I said as he reached me, my voice softer than I meant, the champagne glass cold against my palm. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, his tone low warm, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. He glanced around, taking in the scene, the glittering donors, the banners with the foundation's logo, the weight of what I'd built. "This is yours, Lauren. All of it. They can't take that away." His words landed like a bomb, soothing the raw ache left by Maggie's lies. I wanted to say something, thank him again, tell him how his voice in that conference room had steadied me. But a ripple moved through the crowd, a shift in the air that made my stomach lurch. Heads turned, whispers sharpened, and I followed their gaze to the entryway. Maggie stood there alone this time, her faded jacket stark against the sea of silk and satin. No Jess, no flannel, just her, clutching a manila folder, her face a mask of defiance, and something else, something broken. My heart thudded, a hammer against my ribs, and I felt Chuck tense beside me. The room's golden light seemed to dim, the air thickening with the scent of perfume and anticipation. She didn't move at first, just stood there, her eyes locked on mine across the expanse of polished floor, a challenge I couldn't read. The donors parted, their murmurs rising, and I knew this wasn't over, not yet. My fingers tightened around the glass, the cold biting into my skin, but I didn't look away. "She's got nerve," Chuck muttered, stepping closer, his shoulder brushing mine. A shield, unspoken but solid. "She's got nothing left to lose," I said, my voice steady despite the storm churning inside. I handed him my glass, the champagne sloshing slightly, and took a step forward. The crowd hushed, a collective breath held, and I felt their eyes like a spotlight, searing and relentless. This wasn't the press conference's controlled chaos. This was raw, unscripted, a collision I'd known was coming since I'd cut those ties. Maggie moved then, her boots scuffing the floor as she closed the distance, the folder clutched like a weapon. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the tremble in her hands, the lines etched deeper around her mouth. The menthol on her breath hit me, sharp and familiar, and for a moment I was back in Macon, her pacing the kitchen, me hiding in my room, the weight of her anger a shadow I couldn't outrun. "You think you're untouchable," she said, her voice low, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Up here with your rich friends, your fancy party. You're still pretending you're better than us." I straightened, my heels firm against the floor, the dress's fabric whispering as I shifted. The fury was there, ember flaring in my chest, but it wasn't alone. Pity flickered too, a quiet ache for the sister she'd been. "I'm not pretending anything," I said, my words clear, carrying to the edges of the room. "I built this, Maggie. Not to be better, but to be free. You could have had that too, if you'd let me help you instead of fighting me." Her eyes narrowed, a flash of something, guilt, maybe, or resentment too deep to name. She thrust the folder forward, her knuckles white. "You want help? Here's your help. Every dime you sent, every lie you told yourself about being a saint. I'm showing them who you really are." The crowd gasped, a soft ripple of shock, and I felt Chuck shift behind me, ready to step in. But I raised a hand, stopping him, my gaze locked on the folder. My pulse raced, a drumbeat of dread, but I didn't flinch. "Go ahead," I said, my voice steady, daring her. Open it. Show them. It's the same records I showed today. Proof I gave you everything I could. You're not exposing me, Maggie. You're exposing yourself. Her hand faltered, the folder dipping slightly, and I saw the crack, her defiance wavering, her certainty fraying at the edges. The room was a vacuum. Every eye on us, the tension a wire pulled taut. She could have done it, torn it open, scattered the papers, made her last stand. But she didn't. Her shoulders slumped, just a fraction, and she stepped back, the folder dropping to her side. You're wrong, she said, quieter now, almost a whisper. You'll see. She turned, her boots loud in the silence, and walked out, the doors swinging shut behind her. The crowd exhaled, murmurs erupting, but I barely heard them. My legs trembled, a rush of adrenaline and release crashing through me, and I felt Chuck's hand on my elbow, steadying me as I turned back to him. She's gone, he said, his voice low, his eyes searching mine. You okay? I nodded, though my chest ached, not with fear now, but with a strange, hollow peace. Yeah, I think I am. The gala resumed, the quartet striking up again, the donors drifting back to their drinks, but I stayed there, rooted, Chuck beside me. Maggie's retreat wasn't a victory. It was a fracture, a door slamming shut on the sister I'd lost. But it was also a beginning, a weight lifting I hadn't known I could shed. Later, as the night wound down, Chuck stayed. We stood by the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawling below, its lights a constellation of possibility. You didn't have to come tonight, I said, glancing at him, his profile sharp against the glass. After everything. He shrugged, a faint smile softening his features. You're still you, Lauren. Messy, stubborn, brilliant you. I wouldn't have missed this for anything. The words warmed me, a quiet bridge between us, fragile but real. I didn't know what it meant, reconciliation, friendship, something more, but it was enough for now, a tether to a future I could face. Weeks later, the air smelled of fresh paint and sawdust as I stood in the lobby of my old office building, now transformed into the Financial Freedom Community Center. The 17th floor view was the same, Atlanta skyline stretching wide, the gold dome glinting in the crisp March sun. But the space was different, open, bright, filled with desks and bookshelves instead of legal briefs and conference tables. Volunteers bustled around me, setting up computers, stacking pamphlets, their chatter a hum of purpose that echoed in my bones. My chest swelled, a quiet pride mingling with the peace I'd fought to find. I'd turned the foundation into something tangible, a place for people like me, like Maggie, to break cycles without breaking themselves. The gala had raised millions, the press conferences fallout fading into a narrative I'd shaped. Not a thief, but a builder. My firm had weathered the storm, clients staying loyal, and I'd found my footing again, stronger for it. The elevator dinged, and I turned, my breath catching as Maggie stepped out. She looked smaller somehow, her jacket swapped for a plain sweater, her hands empty, no folder, no fight. Her eyes met mine, wary but softer, and I felt a pang. Hope, maybe, or the ghost of who we'd been. Lauren, she said, her voice rough, hesitant. She stopped a few feet away, the space between us heavy with years. I saw the news. This place. I nodded, my throat tight. It's for people who need it. Real help, Maggie, not checks, not guilt. You could use it too if you wanted. She flinched, her gaze dropping to the floor, then back to me. I don't know how to stop hating you, she admitted, raw and quiet. But I don't want to keep going like this. The confession hung there, a thread of truth I hadn't expected. I stepped closer, the hardwood cool under my flats, and held her gaze. Then don't. Start here. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just a chance. She didn't answer right away, her eyes tracing the room, the desks, the volunteers, the life I'd built without her. Then she nodded, a small, reluctant tilt of her head, and turned to the window, staring out at the city. I watched her, the tension easing from my shoulders, a quiet strength settling in its place. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a crack, a sliver of light through the wall we'd built. The center hummed around us, alive with possibility, And I felt it, the release of a burden I'd carried too long, the promise of something new. Maggie might never step through that door again, but I'd offered it, and that was enough. I'd faced her, faced Jess, faced myself, and I was still standing, not just surviving, but thriving. The skyline glittered beyond the glass, a testament to what I'd claimed, and for the first time in years, I felt free.